Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome and thank you very much for joining Chris and myself on this webinar, which is about GDPR for landscapers. Just to give you some context, my name is Jodie Reed from Penarth Management Limited. We are affiliate members of Barley. We've got a number of landscapers that we work with, and Chris is one of our expert colleagues. And together we've supported numerous organisations, including in the landscaping sector, with their GDPR requirements. So we're going to be looking at, do you find it easy to respond to pre-qualification questionnaires or PQQs and accreditation schemes? But I'm going to hand over to Chris for this. So Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Jodie. So good afternoon, everyone. As Jodie said, this introduction has come about because we've been supporting other landscapers in answering some of the questions that they've been getting from regulators and different bodies. So I'm going to walk you through and give you a taster of the more full and rich courses that we offer to help people, or consultancy we offer to take people through these answers. So let me first show you the questions that we've seen that we get, or your colleagues will be getting, and you may have already received yourself. So on the right hand side you can see 6 questions, and this can land on your doorstep at any moment in time, and these are the real questions that some of your industry colleagues have received. So I'll just read out one of them. Have you documented the personal data you hold, where it came from, and who you share it with? Do you maintain appropriate records and registers of data processing activities? So, would you know how to go about answering that question? Certainly our experience has been from some of your colleagues is that it's a bit of a shock, particularly when you get one question, but imagine in the 6 questions here shown on the page. Where do you start? Do you have the information already? Is it squirreled away in some documentation you have? Next question is, do you have the time to figure out what you need to collect, and then go and collect it, and then assemble it in the right way so you can give it as a response to whoever's been asking for the information? So these 6 questions look very simple and often a one-liner, or certainly 2 lines. They can involve putting together some information in a structured way to respond to someone who's asking for it. And you have to answer it. So I'll explain that why a little bit later on. So the questions will vary from body to body. There is not a set of standard questions that you'll receive. So Chaz may give you some answers, questions in this format. Other bodies will give you another set of questions. In other industries, the worst I've seen was a 27-page form that a client had to go and answer to respond to their data protection questions. So
picking up a big
count yourselves lucky. Absolutely. Count yourselves lucky you only get 6 questions in this case. But it could vary from 6 questions to 10 or 15 questions, depending on how much detail the organisation is asking from you. And what we suspect, we don't know, but we really do suspect that the questions will increase in number and will request more detail as time goes on. It's very important you answer them honestly, and I'll explain why a little later on, but in summary, the data protection laws that are in place now require businesses to document how they acquire personal data, how they store it, how safely do they store it, and if they share it, who do they share it with, and how long do they keep it for. And the onus is on you, the business owner, to have that in documentation to hand. So it's really important to answer them honestly. You need to expand aspects of the business that you may not have documented in the past. You may not have even thought about. Well, until 3 years ago, and when data protection was coming out, people hadn't thought about these things. They hadn't designed their businesses to cater for answering data protection questions. But the reality is the world around us, where we're connected online with our phones and laptops and computers, there are risks and dangers. And data protection is designed to try and help us fundamentally. So I'm going to go through a few next steps in a moment for you, but I just want to give you sort of the global context in which you're operating you may not have thought about. So behind this picture, we've got some thoughts, and I'll just share them with you before I reveal the detail for you. if you think about the world we live in, I mean, we're all living with COVID-19 at the moment, which is a heck of a thing for us all to face. But generally, there is the environment. There is automation. More and more things are going online or digital. We also see more cyber attacks. Now, this evolution to this digital connected world began in the 1980s. And you will have all heard the terms email, browsers, maybe VPNs. You'll have heard of routers, firewalls, and video calls, like the video call we're on today. We're all using mobiles, phones, laptops, tablets to send information, receive information, have video calls, have voice calls. And the world is going down the road of making areas of the world more and more automated, and they call it smart. So you have things called smart cities, you have things called smart factories, you have things called smart transport. And they're all about making those systems more efficient, more robust, so they can carry more people. They can make our lives easier and better and more enjoyable, essentially. So the internet obviously gives us so many great possibilities. There are some dark sides, but there's some fantastic great possibilities, and we should all try and embrace those. The data we share over the internet can be used for good purposes and bad, and largely it's used for good purposes. But there are people out there who will take that data and use it against us. And what we've seen in the last 5 years is new regulations and new standards that have been created to help us curtail the bad side of the internet, the poor side of the internet, and help us enjoy the really good sides of the internet. So we're really in a truly connected world. That's why GDPR has come along. That's why the Data Protection Act of 2018 has come along. And it's why you have things you may see on websites sometimes, badges of honor, which basically say I've got some cyber security measures in place on my website and on my business. So that's the background. We've got a whole range of things that have been developing over the past 25 years, reaching to a point now where we have to take more care of the personal data that we hold in our businesses. And that could be the personal data of our staff, if you have staff, the personal data of your customers, the personal data of your subcontractors, details of any other businesses you work with. So you have to analyze and understand what personal data you carry within the business. And, some businesses have more sensitive personal data than others. And it's up to you as the business owner to understand what data you have. And you may hear a term, a data map. It's a bit like if you want to go on a journey, the best way to go on a journey and make it efficient and less risky is to have a map, and you plan out your journey beforehand. This is very much the same. We're looking at having a data map, a picture of the data you have in your business. You can assess the risk of having it, and where it's a high risk, you make some very changes, and they can often be very small and simple changes to make yourself safer. So the question we get from people, from organizations like yours, is why now? Well, why are you getting these questions now? The regulation says you must take technical and organizational measures to protect the personal data that you hold in your business. And again, that's the data you might have on your customers, on your contractors, on your suppliers. Technical measures typically means the security measures you have. Do you run software to catch viruses that may attack your computer? And increasingly, viruses are happening more and more often. Are you keeping your software up to date? Are you running the Microsoft patches? Are you running any updates that the computer tells you need to do?
I've got somebody here, Chris, saying, I've got Cyber Essentials. Is that any good?
Cyber Essentials is very good, yeah. It's the Cyber Essentials and the Cyber Essentials Plus. Cyber Essentials is the first level of certification the government has sponsored and said it'd be nice to get all organizations up to a basic level of cybersecurity awareness, and that's Cyber Essentials. You have to look at a questionnaire, you have to fill it in with all the knowledge you have. You send it away to an assessor who assesses whether the questions have been answered in a sensible way, and will pass or fail you, and you'll get an attempt, reattempt. Cyber Essentials Plus is more strict and more detailed, and it will mean that a qualified IT person will either come to site or log in, or a combination of both, will come in and check to say what you are doing in security terms you are actually doing. So one is self-assessment, the other one has an external assessment in it.
It's just move on, Chris. It's probably also worth mentioning that for those companies with any ISOs, ISO 27001 is a useful information security standard as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Jodie. Now, most businesses think that they are, you tend to feel you work in isolation, but you are always sharing data with people. Either you'll be getting data from someone else in your supply chain, or you'll be sharing that personal data in your supply chain. An example might be you've got a customer and you collect their details from the website, or they call you, you've got a piece of work you want to do, but you actually subcontract the work out to a team of subcontractors. Well, for those subcontractors to know where to go, you're going to have to pass on the personal details of the person, their phone number, an email address, an address maybe. Typically, that's all you would have to pass on, so it's not high risk, but it's personal data. You must look after it. You must take appropriate measures. And you should be asking your subcontractors what measures they take, because it could be that the subcontractor goes out, loses their phone, and that impacts the persons whose detail is lost on that phone. So what is the impact? We'll talk about that a little bit later on. So you have to think about personal data in your context as your business, and you have to understand that you tend to share that with other people in the performance of doing your work. And that's no problem, it's fine, that's reasonable, but you must understand it and you must document it, and you must make sure you're taking appropriate measures to secure it and keep it safe. When the law changed for GDPR and Data Protection Act 2018, it talked about having evidence. This is where you must keep evidence that you have taken data protection and GDPR seriously. So the regulator has already said they would be more lenient with organizations that can demonstrate they've had data protection training. For some businesses, data protection impact assessments, this is where it's a bit like a health and safety assessment for the personal data you carry. They would look at your data protection impact assessments. And also they may look at any cyber essentials. They've not said that explicitly, but if there were a breach, then that would be one thing I'd be certainly looking at. So you need to be asking these questions that you may have received from one of your bodies. You may need to take those questions and pass them on to your supply chain, to your subcontractors, and ask them to see how they could answer them. What I would advise, though, is get your own house in order first. It'd be embarrassing to not have your house in order and then pass on those questions to your subcontractors. So what I'm going to do next, and these slides will be available to you after the webinar. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to just jump to a self-certification assessment document we've created for GDPR. This has been used with colleagues in your industry, and I'll run through that separately now. That would be why I open up that document. Hopefully you can see that document now. So in the front of this workbook, we work through this workbook. So we tend to come on site, or we can do it remotely. And we would tend to look for the key people in the business to be in the session together. It's important that they all understand what GDPR is. We tend to work to ensure we dispel the myths. At the very beginning of GDPR, a lot of myths were created, and most of them were false and misleading, and we get rid of those myths. We explain what GDPR really is, and for me, it's very simple. It's be open, clear, and transparent with your customers, with your contractors, with your staff, about the personal data you hold on them, the purpose for which you're holding it and using it, how long you keep it for, and you explain to them their rights. And it's not difficult. Once you understand what data you have in the business, it's very easy to explain that. So what we'll ask you to do is we'll share some slides with you and give you a bit of background. Then we'll launch into this workbook and we'll go through. So we ask you to put your name, your company, and the date of the course or the assessment. And we're going to go through this, and you can see here we've got the beginning of the GDPR review. There are going to be 5 areas. And we're going to ask you to complete this as we present some information to you. So we'll share the point we're trying to share. We'll explain the context, and then we let you have time to update this as you go along. And this becomes your reference book. So we'll first of all look at context here. We'll then look at the personal data your organization holds. We'll look at where that data it resides. Where's it kept? Is it on paper? Is it on electronic software somewhere? And we look at who uses it, who has access to it. What security measures do you have in place? And then obviously we create an action list to give you 3 or 4 steps. Typically, it could be up to 10, but no, typically 3 or 4 key steps you can take very quickly to improve your situation and ideally answer those questions that may have come from someone like Chaz or one of the other bodies. So if we go to the next page. So here we walk you through this. We'll walk you through your business and we'll walk you through what organizations do you have. So perhaps you have a website. Who developed the website for you? Does your website have contact forms on there? What we find is many businesses who've commissioned a web developer don't know that the web developer has put a form on the website, and they keep collecting all the personal details of your customers when they come to your website. And that needs to be managed. You need to be asking those questions. So by understanding that you have a website, it's an area that needs to be looked at and understood. Do you do marketing? Do you have a marketing company you work with that helps promote your business? Well, if so, are they collecting any personal information? Are you sharing any personal information with them? You might have other partners. So we have a particular landscaping organization that has part of their business as they take wood chippings and turn them into fuel. And we have other organizations that may have contractors who will go out on site and carry out part of the works that organization may be delivering them as a whole. Most businesses have an accountant. Well, does that mean all the personal data of the staff is held by the accountant? Perhaps if they're doing payroll, yes. If not doing payroll, this might just be an accountant for advice where there's no personal data shared. So it's a low risk. Bigger organizations may well have outsourced HR to a HR person or consultant. So if so, do they have access to personal details of the staff? Do they have access to disciplinary information? Do they have information, health information? These questions would need to be asked. And we go around, and you can see the blank circles here. You can fill in anything specific. If you don't have a website, you put a cross through it. If you don't have any partners, you put a cross through it. If you do, you might put a tick against the accountant. And you can make any notes here as you go along. So you begin to see the context of the environment in which you operate, and usually surprises our clients how connected they are. I think, Jodie, you had a question?
Yes, I was just going to mention that when we look at marketing, we've had it before now where very often people don't think they do much marketing, and then we've worked together and unravelled that there's people with Twitter accounts or various other social media accounts that have long since been forgotten, which in turn becomes quite important when the access requests for data.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Jodie. So once we've got that, we sort of understand how connected we are. And even in this process, we've uncovered in businesses we worked with that they've got multiple businesses within the business. And then really this needs to be looked at from all of those different perspectives. So the next page, what we'll do is we'll start looking at some of the key data areas. Now, if you have staff, then it's important to understand what personal data you hold on staff. Typical things will be obviously full name, home address, email address. You might have next of kin information in there. You may have national insurance number. You may have a driving license details. You may have a passport if they travel for your business in any degree. And you could have a huge list. And what we ask people to do, we'll show you examples of the typical staff data we find in organizations like yours. And then you make a decision what you have in there. And you may put question marks against some of the boxes. You might actually fill in the details. We'll then look at some of the client contacts. You might call them customers. You can put your own terminology in here. You might call it your customers. You might have end users because you're working through someone else. You might have subcontractors, and we can have as many pages as you like for this. But it begins to make you think about the data you have on these different types of people, the different types of personal data you hold. Subcontractors, you could change this box to subcontractors, for example, and list all the data you have on subcontractors. So we had a project recently, and the client had completely forgotten they had the personal details of subcontractors in place. They thought about their staff, they thought about their customers, they'd forgotten about the subcontractors. They'd forgotten the fact that they needed in their subcontractor agreement a data sharing agreement, and they needed to ensure that the subcontractors were keeping their data safe that they were being shared with. And again, there's room to make notes. Number 3 then is where and who. So where do you store this information? Now, one of the myths around GDPR was you had to get rid of paper. That's not true. What you need to do is, whether you have personal data stored in paper form, hard copy form, or whether you have it in electronic form, you need to know where you keep it. What software is it stored on? So, for example, you might be using Xero for your payroll, which is one of the financial packages. Do you know where that personal data that's stored in Xero is kept? Because if it's in the EEA within the GDPR zone, that's fine. If it's not, then you need to make sure your staff are aware of that, because you're shipping their data outside of the protected GDPR area. For example, do you do marketing? Do you use something like a CRM system called HubSpot to manage your client contacts and perhaps do some marketing? Do you use SurveyMonkey for doing surveys and things to your customers? Well, all of these pieces of software will hold the personal details of the people they've sent messages to. You have to manage those systems. They don't manage themselves. So we work through customers to list the systems, the software systems. And it's amazing how we start off with customers saying we've only got 3 or 4 systems. Actually, when we've been through it with them, they've got 10 or 11. And that's even for a small business. And of course, the more systems you've got and the more data you've got on those systems, the higher risk you are. So we walk through and help you understand the software. Endpoints, do you use iPads? Do you use tablets? Do you use iPhones? Do you use Android phones? And if you have an office, do you have a firewall? Do you have a router, like a BT router or an Orange router or Virgin? What other equipment do you have that you store information on? Do you have backup disks? Do you have backup disks that are in a different location? And here we talk about IT. Do you have professional in-house support, professional outsourced? Because this suggests the risk, depending on where you put your tick box in these boxes here, gives us an indication of where your risk is. And we typically find that organizations that don't have any formal support for IT are usually at much bigger risk. They haven't assessed the risks, but they assume then they have low risk to a data protection breach or a cybersecurity attack. And then we go on to security. What security measures have you put in place? Now, one of the quickest and most effective things you can do is to ensure that any login details and passwords on all your different systems are unique. I had the same problem initially. Because I'm human, I've struggled to remember passwords. I'd have the same login details and the same password on 6 or 7 systems. If you do that, you're increasing your risk of having vulnerability in your systems, that some hacker, because they're all automated attacks, will get into one system, your weakest one, your oldest one, and they'll use those credentials to get in and do some damage into your existing system. So we'll go through some of the basic security things that you have in place, teach you to understand that, and you can also make some notes alongside here.
Just got a question in there, Chris, about how do I remember all the passwords?
Yeah, there are tools out there. You'll get experts will disagree, but there are 2 password managers out there which help human beings like myself manage these things. You have to put a very, very strong super password on the software and it manages all the other passwords for you. Other experts will say, have a little black book and keep them away from your computers and anywhere else. Give them to your mother to look after. And give her a ring when you've forgotten your password. It's a difficult one. It's how you assess the risk, but we share that type of information with you. So the next piece we have to come into is the piece where we have legal basis. Under GDPR, you have 6 legal bases for holding someone's personal information. We won't talk about public interest, that's if you're a public authority. But typically, if you have a contract and you describe the personal data that you're collecting, and you describe why you're going to use it, how long you're going to keep it for, and that you're only going to share it with 1 company or 2 companies and that's it, and your customer signs it, it's a very good record of what is happening. As long as you do what you say, that's fine. That's a very strong way of being able to describe and have documentation that evidences what you're doing with personal data. The big one that people think about is consent. And people use the consent as a general term rather than a specific term. Consent here in GDPR means that someone has to give their explicit permission for you to hold their data for a particular purpose. Now, it means that you have to keep very good records if you ask them for consent, and they can remove that consent at any moment in time. It's a valid one. It's one I generally suggest people look at last. Legitimate interest is you as a legitimate business have a legitimate right to have this information, to store it and use it. And there are what's called legitimate interest balancing tests. You have to go and consider your rights against the individual person that you're collecting the data for. So, for example, just because you say you want to market to them, have you overridden their rights to say no? So we go through these to help you understand a little bit more about what these terms are. And then obviously you can make notes. And you'll find that the more areas in your business than you thought. Some will be using consent, some will legitimate interest, and some maybe a contract. And then after that, we round up by, in fact, as we're going through the process, you'll be making notes and giving your own action plan here. And it's great. You walk away with this with a much better understanding of the things that you need to do. You'll understand some of the risks of doing something or doing nothing. You'll understand a broader understanding of the world that you're operating in, because you are connected more than you ever have been before. So what I'm going to do now is just jump back. If Jodie doesn't have any more questions at this point, I'm going to jump back to the presentation. Jodie, is there anything else?
Nothing else at the moment, Chris.
Okay, great. So we'll look through the context. So we're looking at a world where we've had an erosion of trust through all sorts of institutional organizations. We've had this growth in digital, and now we've got this regulation, which you are now legally responsible for managing the personal data that you're responsible for. There will be some new regulation coming in about 2 years' time. And of course, unfortunately, we've been supporting a number of companies recently where they've been defrauded via electronic means. They're getting an email, which they click on, and they provide personal details to someone who then calls them and asks them to pay an invoice. And you wouldn't believe how often we see this type of issue happen. So GDPR, just so you're clear, we were all receiving huge amounts of spam email before GDPR came out, and that was the reason that GDPR actually came from the European Union. Members like you, like Jodie, like myself, we all complained to governments around Europe, and we were fed up of spam email. We were fed up of being targeted by telephone calls and emails, and GDPR was developed to counteract this. Now, the reality was this is always going to take a decade or so to actually make massive change, but it was already changing behaviours of large companies who, frankly, may have been abusing the data that we were giving them. People, large, huge organisations. What you will have seen is that in the last 2 years, more and more data breaches from companies, banks, airlines, even health companies. The biggest breach recently was a company called Doorstep. They were a health company looking at on the doorstep, and they were fined a huge amount of money under the new regulation. So it is beginning to take effect. So what I'd like to do is, just think about who are the companies that you trust, because all of these companies here have all lost our personal data in the last 3 or 4 years. They're all companies we trust. If this keeps happening and we keep having our data abused, will we start to switch to a company that doesn't appear in this list or in the bigger data protection breach lists? I think we will. Now, if you lose the personal data because you haven't secured your business and you haven't talked to your supply chain and asked them to make simple changes, then reality is you could be on this list. GDPR, you can't get away from it. There are very few organizations that don't come under the jurisdiction of the legislation. Class actions are beginning to happen. Clients know their rights. Individuals know their enhanced rights. If you employ staff, we are seeing an unfortunate side of this, that some staff are weaponizing what's called data requests from their organizations. We've seen this with COVID-19, where employees have been made redundant, actually going back and asking for all of the personal data that the organization holds on their behalf. And it's causing a huge amount of work for organizations. So, it is something to be aware of. It is real. It's not going away. And it will increase in time as more people know their rights and will start exercising those rights.
That point about weaponizing and combined with coronavirus seems to be causing a bit of concern here, Chris.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. Right, so I think what I mean by a shifting landscape is that as we see more organizations breach, lose our data, it can happen to any one of us. Once is fine, it happens, it's reality. The bad guys are very good and we need to keep alert and keep making sure we're safe. If an organization fails twice and 3 times, there will always be, in this competitive landscape, someone else to go to. So it's really important that I think we're going to see people continuing to work with businesses, continuing to share their personal data with those that look after the data that you give them. So what you have to do is turn your business into a data castle. So I don't know if any of you recognize that castle, but we came for the football, the European Championships. Was it 2 years ago now, Jodie? Seems a long time ago. This was Cardiff Castle, beautifully adorned. And you can see police officers in the front. Where that grass was, there was a moat. You have high walls. You have battlements. You'll have a fire-breathing dragon at the top who will obviously breathe on anyone who comes close. Just behind over here, you can see would be hidden the portcullis and the drawbridge. They're all the things that a castle is, with strong defences. And you will have a strong defence so you could keep bad things out from coming in, and you may want to protect things inside the castle, like treasure, like plundered goods. You might want to keep cattle and animals and your food safe. So businesses today have to think of themselves in the same way. They are a custodian of information they need to keep safe, and they need to stop it leaving that castle without good reason. So the 2 things that you as a business owner have to do to stay safe is to do the following things: data governance and security, and they go hand in hand as far as I'm concerned. You need to have that understanding I talked about at the very beginning about how you acquire, how you use, how you share the personal data of others. This is your data map. How can you explain it to someone if you don't know it yourself? Really good concepts here. If you don't have someone's personal information, you don't have to worry about how long you retain it for. You don't have to worry about finding it if someone wants to know what you have on them. It's a great time and a great reason to do data cleaning, a bit like your spring clean. Find all the data that you don't actually need. And believe you me, I've not come across any business in the work we do where we haven't found tons and tons of data that is being collected or has been collected in the past, and it's not being used for any good purpose. If you don't need it and you're not using it, get rid of it. You might want to start collecting some new information because there's a valid reason for doing so, but get rid of anything you don't actually need. It'll make your life so much easier in so many ways. everyone in your supply chain can impact your business. So if you have someone else in the supply chain breaches, and you are what's called the data controller for the information, say so you have all your clients' data, and you ask a subcontractor to carry out a service, and they lose that data, they get hacked. You, unfortunately, are still in the firing line. You are a data controller. The law has changed, and they will have some questions to answer. But you, as a data controller, will still have a huge part in the solving the problem. It's a moving landscape. Typically, you're delivering and developing new services. You might be partnering with different people. You might have new products you're developing. Each time you do this, you need to understand: are you collecting new personal data? Are you sharing it with someone new in your supply chain? Some businesses, this aspect doesn't change very often. That's fine. Once you've done it once, keep an eye on it, and it may be very little work. But you do need to think about these things. You've got to ask the questions about security. Are you keeping your systems up to date? Are you keeping them what's called patched? Are you updating them when the systems say to update? If you're using an IT company, are they doing this for you? Do you have a contract that covers them doing that for you? All too often, we see businesses assuming that's being done for them, and the contract is so old that the IT company says, "Well, I'm not being paid for that," so they don't. It doesn't matter if it's your business that has an attack. And we have a business that had a £25,000 invoice fraud perpetrated against them. He had 2 attacks. The first one, he was embarrassed. He didn't know what to do. He ignored it and hoped it would go away and wouldn't happen again. Within a few months, it happened again. We got to meet. We looked at his processes, his systems, and understood what happened. And when we did an analysis of his IT company, we found 240 critical updates to his software not being implemented by his IT company. It's cost him £25,000. He's a relatively small business with 15 staff. Could you survive with a £25,000 hit? It's difficult. That affects cash flow. So it's really important you look at securing your business, whether it's a data protection issue that's driving you to do this, or it's a competitive threat, or just a general hacking threat. You should be looking at securing your business really well. But also, if you're sharing personal data with your customers with your supply chain, you need to be asking them that question, because your regulators, your industry bodies are already asking you. So what it's done is started at the highest part of the supply chain, and it's come down to you. You need to make sure you're secure and have all the process and procedures in place, and then you ask your supply chain to do the same. And if you're not doing it, probably find that your competitors are doing it to the same subcontractors that you both use. So it may not even come as a surprise to them. And one thing the regulator has said is you need to have training, and you need to develop processes and procedures to help your staff manage this in the business. So creating that data castle is really, really important, which we've just talked about. I'm not going to labour the point on the supply chains. And I think that's it for today. Just to give you an introduction, that we provide training courses that can go from half a day. We provide consultancy beyond that. But this was just to give you a flavour that GDPR is here. It's here to stay. There are some serious risks that you need to consider. And please speak to your Barley representative or Jody, and we can provide more help as needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.